This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And we are delighted today to have Brandon Weichert with us. Brandon is a self-admitted recovering congressional staffer who in his real life is a geopolitical analyst. He manages the Weichert Report and is a frequent contributor to Real Clear Politics and Asia Times. And his main role in life is briefing Department of Defense people and interested policymakers on the issue of national security in space. Brandon, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, you know, your new book, which is Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, I found it just fascinating to read. I know Joel did too. And you start off with a premise that I thought was just fascinating, which is that we are very close to having what you described as a space Pearl Harbor. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, and so basically it's a sad thing, but I think that in the next 2 to 4 years is sort of the crisis period of America's position in space. We've allowed for our vulnerable yet vital satellites to go pretty much undefended until the last couple of years. And our enemies, beginning in 2010, both Russia and China in particular, figured out that is attacking our satellites is one way they could seriously neuter the American military advantage. Obviously, in a fair fight, there's no equivalence. Our forces win every time unless you start introducing nukes. But in a fair, clean fight, American forces win every time. You take out those satellites, though, and you've just rendered America's forces operating on land, at sea, in the air, and in cyberspace completely deaf, dumb, and blind. And when you look at what China and Russia are trying to do, Russia's trying to basically cleave as much of Eastern Europe as they can away from the West. And China's trying to take Taiwan in particular, but also the South and East China Seas. And that's closer to their home. And America's far away. And so America relies on satellites to project power over the horizon deep into enemy territory. And the Chinese and Russians since 2010 have reconfigured their forces to fight and win a space war against the United States. And what that would look like, it wouldn't be something like Star Wars. It would be very rudimentary. So for instance, the Russians have for years been pioneering the launching of these co-orbital satellites. My friends in the military community call them space stalkers. The Russians refer to them as Istrebitel Sputnikov. And these are tiny satellites. They're very maneuverable. They have grappling claws, and they can quietly tailgate our sensitive satellites in orbit. And on command, they can latch on to our satellites and physically push them out of orbit. China is also developing laser systems that can dazzle or blind our satellite constellations, leaving them a window of opportunity to do whatever they want, in South China Sea or against Taiwan. anti-satellite weapons, things like surface to air, or in this case, space missiles that can track up and destroy our systems in orbit. Those have been around since the 70s. Russia and China have them in abundance, as do we. But the bottom line is that we have not taken the necessary steps to defend our satellites. And so if and when either China and or Russia decide they can't deal with America anymore, they might not wait to attack us more conventionally. They might decide we have to first blind the Americans and prevent them from being able to bring their power in from over the horizon by launching a surprise attack on those satellites in orbit. And that is the basis of the space Pearl Harbor. It's very similar to the Japanese with the original Pearl Harbor attack. Their logic was knock out that naval base in Pearl Harbor and you've debilitated the American Pacific Fleet, and the Americans will sue for peace because they're a weak and decadent culture. And this gets into the Chinese and the Russian thinking of how America today is decadent and stymied by modern liberalism. And if you can hit them hard enough up front, we'll be confused and shaken so badly that we'll come to the negotiating table and won't even try to stand and fight. And I hope that they're not right, but given the political situation today and what's going on, my fear is that they might be.
But what I'm wondering about is, isn't this really not just a Democratic problem? Obviously, President Biden's only been in there for a brief
it's a
period
cultural
of time.
problem. Yeah, it's a cultural problem.
What is the problem? I mean, what's the explanation for, Bush and as well as Obama and I assume Clinton?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you basically make the point that really we haven't had a strong pro-space president since Reagan.
Right. And even then, Reagan ultimately, the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, ultimately really didn't get very far because the bureaucracy waited him out. And when he left office, even under George H.W. Bush, his successor, they kind of let that program fizzle. And so this is a cultural problem. Part of the problem is it's very costly to do space operations. Another problem is a lot of politicians are short-term thinkers, and they respond to what they think the voters want. And the voters, in a lot of cases, I worked on the Hill for a Florida congressman. A lot of voters outside of the Space Coast in Florida or in Texas really don't see the need to invest so much money and national resources into space when they think they need that money for social programs or education, more terrestrial matters, infrastructure. A lot of them don't see the connection. I think the reason they don't see the connection, though, in many cases, is we haven't had a visionary leader from either party to say, hey, this is what happens if we don't focus on space in some capacity. And I think it's a cultural problem. I talk about this in the book. I talk about how really in the late 1960s, and Peter Thiel says this as well, I've heard him say this before, you have the Woodstock versus the moon landing. And, we had a choice in the late 1960s to go either the way of going toward the future with the moon landings or going the way of Woodstock and decadence and hedonism. And clearly we've chosen Woodstock on some level for the last 50 years, and it's showing. And now our enemies are catching up to us. China talks about this openly. Xi Jinping, the leader of China, he talks about how space is a critical component of the China 2049 initiative, which is his initiative to make China the global power, the superpower, displacing the United States by the 100th year anniversary of the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, which was 1949. And so there's a cultural dynamism to China that is lacking right now in the United States and the West, and it's very scary.
So listening to this, the question I would have is, does the national security imperative of maintaining our communication systems and our GPS systems and all of the things that rely on space satellites, is this helping to elevate the visibility of the problem in the administration, or is it ostrich time?
Well, so from the beginning, because Donald Trump announced the Space Force, Orange Man Bad became, the kind of the motif in the bureaucracy, which is very sad, because you can go back to Donald Rumsfeld's confirmation hearings in 2001, in which he was talking about the need for a space force. And I believe had 9/11 never happened, we probably would have gotten a space force during George W. Bush's administration, because this was something on the minds of many key policymakers at the time. But it languished as an idea for 20 years in Washington's think tank circles. And then Trump was the first president to actually take it seriously. And that meant at least half of Washington and the country was going to poo-poo it, so much so that we had a horrible Netflix series starring Steve Carell making fun of it and making them look like idiots.
It wasn't very good either.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't. And, the problem is that Orange Man Bad became the mentality. So even when they did finally make this a reality, there was a lot of reticence on the part of the professional military people to be associated too closely with the project. Initially, there was concern that ultimately after Trump, it would be gobbled up by the Air Force and would be a dead project. But now we've seen, thankfully, the Biden administration, even though initially they were very dismissive of it, I know for a fact, speaking to people in the military at the top levels of the Pentagon, there is a real acknowledgement that we need to keep Space Force. The problem right now is there's still sort of this ambivalence or listlessness on the part of the policymakers. They don't really know what Space Force is going to do. They know that it has something to do with satellites, but then when you look at the Space Force budget, $15 billion they were given, $15.1 billion. The Air Force has, I think, like 20 times more of an operating budget. This is a rounding error in the Pentagon's overall budget. It's not being taken very seriously, even if the decision makers are at least giving it some kind of support on a bipartisan level. It needs funding and it needs leadership, and right now it's not really getting that.
Well, and what amount of funding do you think would be appropriate?
Definitely more than 15 billion. I would.
We're in a world of we're printing money for everything. So
right, exactly.
My hand is poised on a check. What should I write it for?
Right. I mean, I would think at least something comparable to the Air Force, and I think they had. I actually don't remember what their budget is this year, but it's considerably more, and it's too small right now for them to do anything significant. So you see them developing sort of these protecting the satellite approaches to space doctrine, which is good. We need that. Unfortunately, though, we need to think longer term, because China's not just thinking about the space Pearl Harbor potential. They're thinking in terms of exploitation in the long term. So you see now the space station being put up by China, the modular space station, which is going to outlast America's International Space Station. And the Russians, I think, are probably going to end up connecting to that space station. And you see China also seriously invested in the moon. In fact, Yi Jian, the head of China's lunar program, explicitly told the press in 2018 that China views the moon as the South China Sea, which is a problem, because if you know what they're doing in the South China Sea with all the illegal harvesting of territory that's not theirs, that's a scary prospect. China right now has a robust space program that's only growing in capability. We're having trouble even returning to the moon, let alone going beyond to Mars. China's talking about harvesting the natural resources of the moon and asteroids, and there are many rare earth minerals in particular. Which is the basis of modern technology. You can't build any technology post-1970 without rare earth minerals. The Chinese know this. On Earth, China's trying to dominate that market. If they were to dominate the Earth market and then get to space and dominate that market, you're living in a totally different world now. It's not an American-led system anymore. By definition, it can't be. It's China, because they have all the leverage. And so they're thinking long-term, and we're not.
But one area where we do have more dynamism is in the private sector. Elon Musk.
Yes.
How does this fit in? I mean, the Chinese don't have this. I mean, Marshall and I have interviewed some amazing companies, building rockets with 3D printers, the slingshot people.
Yep.
Are they part of the answer? But
Yes.
there's something they need that's more. Are we in a situation where eventually Elon Musk becomes a subcontractor to China?
Well, that's the concern, because if you look at Tesla, they opened a year and a half ago a factory up in China, and now the Chinese, now that the infrastructure is there, the Chinese are nationalizing it. You see, China has replicated the Starship rocket. So the problem is with the private sector, which our private sector is still second to none. The problem is, though, there's no incentive to keep them from going over to China and doing business. And so the Chinese, they want, it's the field of dreams mentality. If you build it, they will come. The Chinese build the infrastructure that allows for high-tech R&D to take place in a way that has not really been done in the United States since probably the 1960s. And these tech companies are saying, hey, there's a lot of benefits financially to us going over there and working over there and developing in combination with the Chinese state the new technology, whether it's rockets or biotech or whatever. And so the problem with the private sector is that they are kind of globalized. They don't have to stay here in the United States. And that's why in the book I talk about the need for a robust industrial policy of the kind that we used to do, in the last century. People think that Silicon Valley was built by libertarians. It was not. It's not a libertarian's paradise.
No,
it was built.
You're very much right about that. I'm a historian of California,
right.
So
yes, exactly.
I mean, the up until fairly recently, the largest employer in Silicon Valley was Lockheed Missiles and Space.
Right.
Ames is up there, and of course, our tech sector here in Southern California, is very much based around space, aerospace.
Yep.
Well, how do you handle this particular point that I hear people make? So, if we look at the last, since 1492 or since the early 1400s, when the era of exploration started, it has been very much of a national enterprise, right? With powers, and then of course trying to project power beyond your own borders. It's very easy to say, okay, this will be an extension of it. But, hey, I'm wearing my Orville Planetary Federation T-shirt, right? So if you talk to kind of the future sci-fi Trekkies like me, it's like, well, there's going to be, the United Federation of Planets.
Right.
Is there an opportunity to kind of build transnational cooperation that might diffuse some of these national tensions? How would you do that?
So in the book, I get into some of the top space programs in the world, I think, that aren't really talked about. So India is leading the world in low-cost satellite launches. Japan is developing, with Toyota, a robust lunar mining and asteroid mining capability at cost. Brazil, until COVID hit, and remember, my book came out, I finished the book in December 2019. So this was right before COVID really kind of, hit the world. But Brazil has a lot of capabilities inherent to its geographical location, because it's so close to the equator. You can do very cheap launches into low Earth orbit from Brazil because it requires less fuel to get into low Earth orbit from the equator. You use the natural roll of the Earth to basically push the rocket into orbit.
That's why the French use Guyana?
Guyana, yes. And in the book, I talk about how if you want to know if NATO's going to space, ask the French, because really, they are the leader of NATO's, besides the United States, they are the leader of NATO's space capability. In fact, France created a space force a year and a half before the Americans did. And actually, a lot of our Space Force people are looking to France for doctrinal inputs on how to create a space force and what a space force should do. France is the one that has come up with using the co-orbital satellites I talked about earlier, using them as bodyguard satellites to put them around critical NATO and allied satellite networks to prevent physical interference from Russian or Chinese space stalkers or anti-satellite attacks from the ground. And so you have a lot of countries in the book I didn't mention, I wish I had, Australia, Britain now, because they're no longer part of the EU and they're now kind of doing their own thing. They're developing again a very robust space capability. These are countries and Israel is, by far one of the most impressive. So it's a little country with big capabilities and dreams in space. And these are countries that we should be uniting with us and burden sharing in space to keep America's lead in space without breaking the bank. And to get back to the Elon Musk question, yes, I think that we should be, as the Defense Department has learned, should be using Musk's, in particular, his reusable rocket. The DoD uses the Falcon 9, which is entirely indigenously built. It is built right here in the US of A. All of it is. And it has cut down launch costs on the DoD for the last 8 years by about 40%. In another few years, Musk says if they keep using him and with the techniques he's perfecting, he thinks he can get it down to 70%. And when you save the DoD, or when the DoD saves money on these launches, it allows them to take that money that would ordinarily be used for launching our sensitive systems into orbit and funnel that money into other more important projects in space or elsewhere, high-tech R&D. And so I think we should be using all of the private startups in space, Musk in particular, but we should be looking at Virgin Galactic, we should be looking at Bigelow, we should be looking at, all these different groups that are really coming up with innovative ways and capabilities to get Americans into space and to keep our dominance. And how we do that, I think something that we should look at, and David Goldman, my colleague over at the Asia Times, he talks about this a lot too, a minimum of a 1 trillion, since we're throwing money around, a minimum of a $1 trillion, probably more, investment over the course of the next decade in federal-backed high-tech R&D, not just in space, but in quantum, biotech, I mean, you name it. And this is one area I think the Biden administration actually has been very good about. His speech a couple days ago, Biden's, was relatively sleepy. But when he talked about high-tech R&D and government funding, he's apt. He is 100% correct. And I hope that the Republicans get behind him on this. My concern, obviously, is that the money would be used to fund boondoggles like Solyndra. But if we could get the Republicans on board with the Democrats and negotiate where that money is going to go, I think we could make sure that we have a honeypot full of money that then gets the private sector, so kind of like an X Prize, gets the private sector.
And on that point, let's say we did, right? Which,
right.
I think we can hope this would be a great area of political cooperation that I think would be potentially out there. If we did, how would you go about, from a policy point of view, dealing with the bigger picture policy, right? This is not just a military question. It's not just an economic question. It's a really holistic problem. How would you actually tackle building a cohesive strategy? Would you create a new cabinet level post? I mean, what kind of things would you do?
Well, the Pentagon already has, if I'm not mistaken, created a kind of chief innovation officer post. I actually think they should elevate a post like that to cabinet level. I think that, I mean, I'm not a fan of creating more bureaucracy, but not all bureaucracy is bad. A bureaucracy with a mission can actually do a lot of good. Remember, NASA was created not to take pretty pictures of the sky. It was created to kick the Soviets' butts in the space race. And one of the reasons that NASA has really fallen to pot lately is because they haven't had an enemy. They haven't had a competitor to compete against. And now with China, this is a blessing in disguise. Now with China, you have organizations that were created as Cold War fighting institutions. They now could potentially have a new mission set that forces them to prioritize things that get people interested and make us want to win again. And so I think,
I was going to say, to that point, right? The growth of the stakeholder base that came about in the original space program to compete against Sputnik, that's exactly what we're talking about. We have so many people with so many different interests.
Right.
My just big concern is how do you herd the cats?
Well, the first thing is you put a pot of money down and you say, look, this money, you will win this money, company X, if you can create an efficient quantum computing system, quantum internet, some new biotech thing that benefits America first and then the rest of the world. Look at the COVID vaccine. Trump does not get enough credit for this. Operation Warp Speed was exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. It was a perfect marriage of public-private sector to do something highly innovative in a relatively short amount of time. Now, are there going to be downsides? Yes, I'm sure there will be some kind of downside risk in the long run. But in the short run, we catapulted ourselves ahead of China and all the other competitors, with the exception of maybe AstraZeneca, which I think is British. But we have the most amount, I think, right now of different kinds of vaccines. All of them are very, very effective for the most part, and all of them are very revolutionary. So if we could take that model, scale it up, and say to the private sector, we need a cheap, reliable new rocket system or whatever, create it in X amount of time, and you're going to win $250 million as seed money or whatever. That, I think, is one way to go about it. We used to have things like Bell Labs. We used to have government-funded private sector innovation where the government came in, put the initial tranche of cash down because nobody in the private sector could really foresee what a computer would do or what the internet could achieve or what telecommunications could do. But our government said there's a strategic potential here. So we'll lay the infrastructure down. Venture capital, once they see that infrastructure is laid, venture capital then says, you know what? The risk has been lowered sufficiently by the taxpayer that we're willing now to come in with our innovators and invest and let them spin off and create Candyland. And that is basically what happened in the last 60 years in America with high-tech development. But if you look on a graph, and again, I reference the work of David Goldman for this, if you look at a graph of high-tech federal research and development investment, it begins declining precipitously in the early 90s. Actually, it begins declining along with the rise of the Republican Congress in 94, which, again, I'm a Republican myself, but it begins precipitously declining at precisely the moment China began pouring all of that money they made by being the sweatshop of the world. They then began upsurging their investment into high-tech R&D and STEM education for their young people. And at some point they cross,
right,
like the 2010s.
And by the way, this is across many domains. My particular field is tracking investment in AI.
Yes.
And the Chinese are outpacing us in investment in AI. So, and the good news is we have a model. We have DARPA. Right. We have the kind of things that DARPA does in terms of creating pilot projects.
Yeah.
And that just, what you're saying is what we need to do is just kind of expand that to more
Scale
domains.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Makes sense.
Just to put it all together, while we're, as we're wrapping up, I think one of the things I'm really concerned about, I thought what really struck me in your book was when you started talking about young people want to be Justin Bieber and not Buzz Aldrin. Right. And the bottom line is great countries have a esprit, a zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it. Obviously the British had it in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. We had it in the 20th. And I just look around and I'm looking at particularly not so much the working class Americans. I think the working class Americans might be excited by this, but I think that a large part of our educated elites they're not in favor of they don't want the United States to be preeminent. They're living in a dream world.
Yeah, you're right about that. And I deal a lot with the Silicon Valley space people. And there is certainly a globalist tilt to the way that they view the world. But I think if the money from the government was tethered, as China does, was tethered to American national interests first, I think the innovators would have no choice because they want to innovate. At the end of the day, they want to do what they're good at. And if a lot of the money, or if easier money, is to be made by doing this sort of public-private co-op, I think actually over time, you'll start to see sort of a return to what we had in the mid 20th century. I also talk a lot about in my lectures, and this is a congressional issue. I talk a lot about, for instance, for making technology transfers from US-based tech firms to China illegal and classifying it as a bribe under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which would not take very long to change the behavior of these firms, because one of the easiest ways a Google or an Apple or you name the high-tech firm, one of the easiest ways they gain access to the huge market share in China is China says, hey, you got to give us some of your secrets, some of your industrial secrets, and we'll let you in. And they do that. And then, of course, China creates an indigenous copy of that, and they spin off from there. And then suddenly these companies are being challenged globally by a Chinese firm with their tech. So I think one of the easiest things we could do is say, you're not allowed to dump technology over there anymore. And oh, by the way, don't worry about it, because we're going to throw $1 trillion on the ground here. You guys and gals come and pick it up, and you build your product here, and we'll give you incentives and tax breaks and whatever to keep you here, to keep you innovating in America, hiring Americans. This also then gets in, of course, to STEM education and education in general in America, which is a national security concern. We don't look at it that way. China does. It's why they're eating our lunch. And so what we would need, I think, to partner at the government level with what I'm talking about in sort of the military and defense side, we would also need the Department of Education to fundamentally be reformed so that they start educating our kids to not just like the country they're living in, but to also want to contribute to it and to also want to build out. And that this is, this is a longer term issue.
Right, but recognition of competition sharpens the mind.
It does.
And so I think that's one of the points you're making here is that we haven't really thought of the intensity of the competition as it's going on, but in fact, it's very real. It's real. It would be very helpful to us to kind of look at it that way.
And one real quick thing, I mean, remember the baby boomers during the Cold War, they had their moment of revolution, but ultimately a lot of those boomers ended up helping to contribute to beat the Soviets. And so I think even when you have American young people who may not really like America or don't like the history or whatever, ultimately they want to still be here rather than elsewhere. And I think if they recognize the competitive nature of what we're going through today with China, and I think eventually they're not going to have a choice but to recognize it, hopefully not before it's too late. I think if they recognize it, that they will start inputting here, and we will start being able to at least keep up, maybe even hopefully ahead of China. But it's going to take time.
Well, Brandon, thank you so much. Brandon Weichert, your book, Winning Space, How America Remains a Superpower, just couldn't recommend it more highly as a read. Thank you for joining us on the Feudal Future podcast.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Brandon.